I believe it was in the first service last week. I'm going to answer that, and then we're going to begin with a word of prayer first. Lord, thank you so much for this beautiful day. We pray now, Lord, as we entertain our 12th week together, that Lord, that you again, we're here to just glorify you, Lord. How you not only intervene in our nation's history, but how you have the answers to all the difficult questions. And so we give you the praise and thanksgiving in your name, Jesus. Amen. So the question was asked of me last week about colonization. Was there any type of colonization program? Did Thomas Jefferson have a colonization program? Which simply means that for those that freed slaves that wanted to not stay here in America, remember, they were all brought as slaves, so some did not want to stay here. And so we were involved in one, but not Thomas Jefferson. A program started in 1821. Okay, 1821, and it was called the American Colonization Society. And so we actually, as a nation, purchased land in Africa, which became what nation? What? Nope, Liberia, Liberty. Yeah, Liberia. And over a period of years, 15,000 slaves were repatriated to Liberia to have their own country for those that did not want to stay here. And the capital of it is Monrovia. Do you know who that would have been named after? President Monroe. Yeah, because President Monroe and President Madison together were involved in the purchasing of Liberia, which is a country today. And as a matter of fact, it got its statehood in 1847. And the repatriation of slaves continued from 1821 till 1904, and believe it or not, the American Colonization Society existed till it was disbanded in 1964. It was around a long time, way after the repatriation was going on. It remains today, Liberia is Africa's oldest republic, okay? And a question was also asked, do they have a similar thing in Great Britain? They did. But there, to repatriate slaves in Great Britain, they went to a place called Sierra Leone. How many have heard of Sierra Leone? That's the nation right to the north of Liberia, okay? Or is it to the south? I think it's to the north of it. Yeah, they're right next to each other. Those countries are right next to each other in the western part of Africa. So that was that question answered. Okay, so last week we dealt with the whole question of slavery and how most people today really historically don't understand that as a British colony, that we were forced by Great Britain. That's how the slaves came to originally here. We were forced to have slavery. And then once we achieved our independence, there were laws in place. There was a lot of debate that went on. As a matter of fact, at the Constitutional Convention, it was debated. It was the southern slave states that kept slavery here on our continent, whereas the northern non-slave states did not want it. And so all this argument went on. But to keep the colonies and eventually the states together, they really wanted, as we mentioned last week, the 3/5 clause in the Constitution was not something that was pro-slavery. As Frederick Douglass, we read from Frederick Douglass, he realized that the 3/5 clause was actually anti-slavery because it was limiting the southern states from being able to have one vote per slave to only 3 votes for every 5 slaves because they tried to play it at both ends of the coin, or both sides of the coin. The southern slave states said that slaves were just property, but then when it came to elections, they wanted it to be 1 slave for 1 vote. And so that was a limitation put on with the hope that eventually through legislation, slavery would be dealt with, because there were some prophetic voices that spoke back then that said it's either going to be handled through the legislature or it was going to end in civil war. It ended in civil war, 1861, 1865. We went into the whole emergence of the Republican Party and how it was the Democrats in response to the Republicans who Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, part of the Republican Party that came into being back in that time. And then the Democrats created the Ku Klux Klan in response to what the Republicans had done. Okay, so we went through all that history last week. So when you actually get into the history, it's not quite what you think it is in terms of today. Okay, so today I raised there was two moral issues that people look back to come against our founding fathers, to say that they should not be the moral compass for us today because most of them were slave owners, because the people today don't understand slavery back there and the legal aspect of it. And then the second issue kind of dovetailed into that. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson are the most disparaged of our original founding fathers. Thomas Jefferson, because not only was he a slaveholder, but he was accused of having sexual relationship with one of the slaves, which supposedly produced in the Jefferson line children. And so that's what I want to deal with tonight. And we're going to deal with it factually instead of just because of people's prejudices towards Thomas Jefferson. Today we will consider another reason people reject the founders as moral guides for our age. Not only is Thomas Jefferson ridiculed because he was a slave owner, but he is accused of having children with a 13-year-old slave by the name of Sally Hemings. This paints a broad brush picture of the immorality of slave owning, which knows no bounds if he actually did that with his slave. What are the circumstances surrounding the accusation? And what tonight is going to be is really an ability or a challenge to deal with critical thinking. And then also I want to make some comparisons to what the argument was back in 1801 compared to arguments on podcasts today for a very different thing, but in terms of the difference between offering facts or just innuendo. Okay, because what we're going to see is the attack on Thomas Jefferson is all about innuendo and then an attempt to put it under science. But then that science was shown, like today in many areas, not to be science at all. But there'll be some really strong correlations between the attempt to come against Thomas Jefferson and the attempt to come against different political and religious things today in terms of people's agendas. So we'll try to see some of those comparisons. In 1787, Thomas Jefferson traveled to Paris, taking with him his 9-year-old daughter, Polly, and a 13-year-old companion for Polly, Sally Hemings. Sally was a daughter of one of Jefferson's slaves. Charges that Jefferson fathered children with Sally Hemings were the subject of the 1995 feature movie Jefferson in Paris and the CBS's 2000 TV movie Sally Hemings, An American Scandal. So what I want to share with you here now is between like 1801, this is not going to resurface until the 1990s, all right? This latter release, speaking of the 2000 TV movie, was a result of a 1998 scientific journal called Nature, a study that they produced, proclaiming, quote, this is what happened in 1998. The scientific journal Nature proclaimed, quote, DNA analysis confirms that Jefferson was indeed the father of at least one of Sally Hemings' children. Okay? That is what they got your attention with, okay? Within 2 days of the release of the Nature study, newspapers declared Jefferson to be a sexual predator and child molester. The Nature article claimed that Jefferson was definitely the father of Eston Hemings, the youngest of Sally's children, yet only 8 weeks after releasing the story, Nature issued a retraction admitting, quote, the title assigned to our study was misleading. While the researchers did find Jefferson genes present in the descendants of Eston Hemings, they could not say they were the genes of Thomas Jefferson because they had not tested the DNA of any of Thomas Jefferson's descendants. they tested only the genes of the descendants of Thomas Jefferson's uncle, Field Jefferson, and of his nephews, Samuel and Peter Carr. In fact, there were 26 Jefferson males living in the central Virginia vicinity at that time, 8 of which lived close enough to Monticello to have been party to the heinous deed. Herbert Barger, this is very important, Herbert Barger, the Jefferson family historian and genealogist who assisted in the original DNA study for Nature, strenuously objected to the published conclusions. Now, this is the guy that was working with Nature, the publication, on the Jefferson story. He strenuously objected to the published conclusions. He stated, quote, "My study indicates to me that Thomas Jefferson was not the father of Eston or any other Hemmings child. The study indicates that Randolph, Thomas's younger brother, is possibly the father of Eston and the others. Randolph, named for his maternal Randolph family, was a widower and between wives when shortly after his wife's death, Sally became pregnant with her first child. She continued having children until 1808 when Eston was born. Randolph Jefferson would marry his second wife the next year, 1809. And significantly, 3 of Sally Hemings' children, Harriet, Beverly, and Eston, the latter 2 not common names in that era, were given names of the Randolph family. Okay. In Nature's retraction, they stated, quote, "It is true, men of Randolph Jefferson's family could have fathered Sally Hemings' later children. Unfortunately, the Nature retraction received little notice, as the Wall Street Journal noted, quote, "Of course, the backtracking comes a little late to change the hundreds of other headlines fingering Thomas Jefferson." Okay, so you see what's developing here. This is all going to be based on innuendo. We are going to read together in a couple minutes the actual original article of the individual that claimed that Thomas Jefferson had these illegitimate children. Okay, but before we do that, I want to bring in a couple thoughts here. Number one, let's look at the Charlie Kirk about the bullet. Here's some recent headlines. There's Thomas Jefferson. There's 3 headlines concerning the bullet. Okay, this is the first one that appeared March 30th of this year. In the Daily Mail, headline that read, quote, "Bullet used to kill Charlie Kirk did not match rifle allegedly used by suspect Tyler Robinson," new court filing claims. Now, I want you to look at what they're saying here. They're saying that the bullet that killed Charlie Kirk did not match the rifle by the fellow they've caught and are putting on trial. Then the next one appeared in the British magazine, The Guardian, or paper The Guardian. Quote, "Charlie Kirk bullet analysis finds no conclusive link to rifle found near scene." Then the third one, I'm just picking 3 of the papers that ran this, and many more ran it, and this was actually an online group. "Bullet used to kill Charlie Kirk did not match Tyler Robinson's rifle." Okay, so when you look at those 3, what is your takeaway from that? That it was the wrong bullet. That means that Tyler Robinson didn't do it. Okay, that's because of the headlines. But then what was discovered is that the reason why it didn't match is that the bullet itself was so badly mangled in the process of the killing that it left none of the normal identifying characteristics that would be able to judge it that it came from that rifle. So that's an entirely different thing, isn't it? One is it's a different person because the bullets didn't match. And if you read that, you go, ha-ha, conspiracy, over against the fact that the bullet itself was so mangled that they couldn't get any positive things off of it. Okay? So that's what I meant by that. This is also an exercise tonight in critical thinking and being very careful when someone's presenting something to you, that make sure that it is being presented correctly. The next thing I want to look at is the picture. Let's do that next one. The recent picture of President Trump. Oh, President Trump. If you haven't followed this, people, how audacious, how ostentatious, how awful of the president to put himself as Jesus Christ, bringing healing to this man. Okay? Now, in reality, this picture first appeared in February of this year, and it was put online by a fellow by the name of Nick Adams with this quotation. Quote, "America has been sick for a long time. President Trump is healing this nation." And then if you listen to President Trump, what he said, he was aghast. He said, how could anybody come to the conclusion I'm trying to make myself out to be Jesus? What he was saying was that his policies are bringing healing to the sickness in our nation caused by the previous administration. That's what he was saying there. So you might not like this picture because of the fact that he has the red and white on, which when this came out, and what it has to do with was a representative from the Red Cross was at the White House, and that this came into being at that time. Up in the center, people were aghast. They said it's some sort of demonic creature in the middle, but in reality, those three, if you would, parts of the headdress go with the Statue of Liberty. And so what he was saying here, and then the wings behind it, is that there was healing on the wings of his policies. Now, this, if you take a look at another thing out of history, you'll see what might be taken as a gas today until you know the real meaning. And that is the apotheosis from the Capitol building. Okay. And then what he did, in just a minute, I'm going to ask you to go and zoom in on it because that's what Leo was able to do. But you'll see in the middle, in the center, there's a historic figure there. Do you know who that was? It's George Washington. Let's show the close-up. That's the other close-up, the other close-up. There we go. There's George Washington up on top there. And surrounding him are two figures. One represents liberty, and the other represents justice. And then there's 13 angels around him, and that's signifying the 13 original states. And what this is symbolizing, it's an allegorical painting, is that from heaven, George Washington, the father of our country, who is aided by God in the establishing of our country, is looking down on future generations to make sure that the future generations are being faithful to the origination of our country. Does that everybody understand that? So whenever you get in terms of allegorical paintings, whether it's President Trump, it's not often, what doesn't often matter is facts. What matters is people's feelings, their emotions, their prejudices. If they have a specific feeling, then whatever the form of it is, without the facts, it might fuel how they're feeling. So instead of seeing the president, speaking of President Trump or George Washington, how could anybody look at that picture of George Washington looking down like he's in heaven with the angels? Because if a person didn't like George Washington, and if you know anything about every president, you have people that like them and you have people that dislike them. Not everybody liked George Washington. When we talked about George Washington, we knew that one fellow tried to take over from him, okay? And then in terms of Thomas Jefferson, a lot more people dislike Thomas Jefferson, okay, than even George Washington. But think about our recent presidents. Does everybody love President Trump? Did everybody love President Biden? Did everybody love President Obama? Can you tell me a president that everybody loved? No, they all had factions against them, all right? So what I'm simply saying is there's nothing new under the sun. What was before will be again. And as we get deeper into this tonight, you're going to find it's not a matter about facts. It's a matter about an individual who was very angry at President Thomas Jefferson. Just like when we discussed Benedict Arnold, we know that when he was court-martialed, he came out of that an angry man. It will eventually lead to him being a traitor. And the individual that is behind this story of Thomas Jefferson was a person that felt that Thomas Jefferson wronged him, and he became an avid adversary to him. Now, again, why? A lot of it has to do with character of a person, so that's what we want to get into. We want to take a look at the character of the individual who brought these charges. And let me start right here. With the unfounded and sensationalized release proven to be an error, I'm speaking now of the 1995 and 1998 Nature presentation, and then the retraction they had to give because of the misleading headline. With the unfounded and sensationalized release proven to be an error, the question remains, we're in 1995. What would have caused the suspicion to exist in the first place, going from 1801 to 1995, the year 2000? The answer to that question centers around a convicted felon by the name of James T. Callender. Callender was born in Scotland in 1758. He was informally educated and later employed as a clerk in Edinburgh. He began writing political pamphlets around 1790 in Great Britain. His work, quote, "The Political Progress of Britain," end of quote, focused on corruption, taxation, and the abuses of power in the British government. It is known for its scathing analysis of the British Empire's political and social conditions. His work was outlawed in Great Britain in January of 1793. As a result, Callender fled to America, arriving in the United States in May of 1793. So he writes a scathing report against Britain, and so it's considered seditious, and they outlaw the book. So he gets on a boat and heads to America. Then what does he do when he gets here? Establishing himself as a journalist in Philadelphia, he now proceeded to criticize elements in the U.S. Constitution. Further, he attacked George Washington, who he said, quote, deceived the nation by promoting himself as a popular idol. Now, as we've discussed George Washington in these past 12 weeks, if there's someone that didn't self-promote themselves, it was George Washington. Never took a salary, didn't want to become president, but took it. There was no one else really that had the background he did. And then as soon as he was done, as we read, people said he could have become king. But instead, he just wanted to go home. He wasn't self-promoting. But to this guy who considers himself a journalist, he was self-promoting. Callender gained and then lost a job with the Philadelphia Gazette and turned to writing pamphlets favoring Jefferson's party. Despite employment, though, he was continually in debt. So Jefferson helped him by securing him a position on the Republican paper, the Aurora, and provided him with money off and on for several years. Then in 1799, Callender moved to Richmond, Virginia. His anti-federalist pamphlet, quote, "The Prospect Before Us," end of quote, led to his prosecution here in America under the Sedition Act. He was found guilty on May 24th, 1800, and sentenced to 9 months in jail and a $200 fine. When he got out of jail in the spring of 1801, Callender expected President Jefferson to reward him for his work and loyalty. He wanted the Richmond, Virginia postmaster job, but he did not get it. That was an appointment from Thomas Jefferson. He did not get it. In President Jefferson's view, Callender was now too radical, and in an attempt to foster reconciliation between parties of that day, after the difficult election of 1800, which was between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, and it was a very aggressive election, one against each other. Jefferson did not patronize, the more militant or radical members of his party because he was trying to work towards reconciliation. Jefferson wrote, quote, "I am really mortified at the base ingratitude of Callender. It presents human nature in a hideous form." In February of 1802, Callender joined with Federalist newspaper editor Henry Pace and began to attack both parties, and particularly Jefferson, because he's mad at him. In a series of articles beginning on September 1st, 1802, Callender alleged that Jefferson had several children by a 13-year-old slave concubine, Sally Hemings. Okay, is everybody up to date with the story now? We're just taking this in order, okay? If you'll put up now his article written in 1801 claiming Jefferson had sexually molested and had children by the 13-year-old slave child. And this is from the Virginia Recorder. This comes from Richmond, Virginia. And next week, that's where we will be in Richmond. We'll be at Williamsburg. We will be at Yorktown. We will be at Cape Henry, where the covenant was given. Excuse me. And here's what he wrote. And I'm going to use emphasis here so that you don't miss what he's saying. It is well known that the man whom it delighted the people to honor keeps, and for many years past has kept, as his concubine, one of his own slaves. Her name is Sally. The name of her eldest son is Tom. His features are said. Now, the reason I say that, I'll read a little bit later from a historian that said that this guy never once went to Monticello. He never interviewed Sally Hemings. He's just going to give innuendo and no facts. The name of her eldest son is Tom. His features are said to bear a striking, although sable, resemblance to those of the president himself. The boy is 10 or 12 years of age. His mother went to, as a 13-year-old, went to France in the same vessel with Mr. Jefferson and his two daughters. The delicacy of this arrangement must strike every person of common sensibility. What a sublime pattern for an American ambassador to place before the eyes of two young ladies. If the reader does not feel himself disposed to pause, in other words, what he's trying to say, think about this. He went to Paris with two daughters and a slave girl. Doesn't that seem a little odd to you all? If the reader does not feel himself disposed to pause and think, we beg leave to proceed. Some years ago, this story had once or twice been hinted at in Rhine's Federalist. It wasn't, no accusations were made in that regard. At that time, we believed the surmise to be an absolute calumny, and that means it was made up to ruin his reputation. It was a malicious statement against the president. One reason for thinking so was this. A vast body of people wished to debar Mr. Jefferson from the presidency, among which, this is editorial comment, among which Callender was the chief. The establishment of this single fact, that he had had sexual relationships with this slave girl, the establishment of this single fact would have rendered his election impossible. We reasoned thus that if the allegations had been true, it was sure to have been ascertained and advertised by his enemies in every corner of the continent. Does that sound at all familiar with the Epstein files and President Trump's election in 2000? In other words, that was the argument. Now, it can be used correctly or incorrectly. Here it's being used incorrectly, but that was one of the arguments. Look, nothing has ever pinned President Trump with Epstein. And believe me, people said, If the Democratic Party could have pinned it, they would have. Okay? So I'm saying nothing is new under the sun. The arguments, the approaches, especially if it's a person filled with anger because he felt he had been done wrong. Okay? The suppression of so decisive an inquiry serves to show that the common sense of the federal party was overruled by divine providence. Now, what he's saying there is he's sarcastic. He's saying God must have intervened on this. No, he's not really saying that. He's saying it was hidden. Okay, that's what he's saying. It was the predestination of the Supreme Being that they should be turned out. Now, the turning out, he's talking about the election cycle with John Adams. Because if you'll remember, Callender, at first, he was playing both sides of this. He was looking for the opportunity to gain, because he needed money, from one side or another. So for years, the 2 years prior, or during this election cycle, he was against John Adams and called John Adams all sorts of terrible names, okay? And then he pumped up President Jefferson, and now he's upset because President Jefferson, two things, but we'll just talk about one right now. The one thing he was mad about is he wasn't given the postmaster job when he felt that since he was writing articles favoring Jefferson, Jefferson owed it to him. So after he got out of jail, he should have gotten that. That they should be expelled from office, the popularity of a character, which at that instant was lying fettered and gagged, consumed and extinguished at their feet. In other words, they were hiding it. They weren't going to let it out because he's going to name the people that were hiding it. We do not wish to give wanton offense to many very good kind of people concerning a certain sort of connections. We have already stated that of boys and bachelors. That's like the Good Boys Club. We have said nothing, and we have nothing to say. They will be pleased, therefore. In other words, he's saying here, there's some people that are going to go, what are you talking about? Are you talking about me? He's saying, no, it's not everyone. Why? Because the more people that stand up against what he's saying, the worse it's going to be for him. So he's going to try to diffuse the situation now by giving an illustration, which is really no more than a word salad. They will be pleased, therefore, to stand out of the way. When the king of Prussia was upon the point of fighting the great and decisive battle of Lissa, he assembled his principal officers and under the penalty of his utmost contempt, exhorted them to bravery. In the midst of this address, an old veteran dissolved into tears. My dear general, said Frederick, I did not refer to you. Some of our acquaintances, now he's going to flip it into his present. Some of our acquaintances are, upon the same principle, requested to believe that we do not, in this allusion, refer to them. We have formally stated that supereminent pretensions to chastity are always suspicious, meaning if you try to defend yourself when an accusation is made you and it has to do with sexual affairs, well, there's suspicion to that, okay? And again, one only has to look at what's happening right now in Congress, because you've had two Congress people, resign this week, and you've got two more that it is believed they're probably going to resign too. And I believe it's what the Lord showed me, that this year that with our eyes we're going to see the reward of the wicked, whether it's Maduro in Venezuela, whether it's Khamenei in Iran, or whether it's a drug czar in Mexico, or whether it's Congress people in the United States. And it's not just one party, it's both parties. Those two that just resigned represent the two different parties, okay? So when God moves and God rewards the wicked, folks, he doesn't care what party you're in. He's wanting to know whether you did right or wrong, whether you are righteous or unrighteous. So you're not going to escape. This hint was sufficiently plain to show that the recorder, this is the name of the newspaper that he wrote this in, the Richmond Recorder, does not desire to set up a manufacture of wry faces. The writer of this essay does not bear the stamp of a Scots Presbyterian parson of the last century, meaning, how would you say it? I asked someone that has Scottish in his blood in the first service, and he told us what he's talking about was a person that would be, really stiff, like that. No. He says, we're not coming across that way. But still, we all know that some things may be overlooked, which can hardly be excused, and which it is impracticable either to praise or even to vindicate. Such is human nature and such is human life. One of our correspondents very justly observes that, quote, there is nobody of whom something disagreeable may not be said, end of quote. In other words, he's justifying his attack on the president at that point. No one escapes the fact that if they've done something wrong, we can lodge a claim against them. And now he's going to go for the kill. You ready? By this wench, Sally. Wait a second. I thought she was a 13-year-old little girl who's been taken advantage of by the future president of the United States. No, he shows his colors here. By this wench, Sally, our president has had several children. There is not an individual in the neighborhood of Charlottesville. We will be at Charlottesville next week. We'll be at Monticello next week. There is not an individual in the neighborhood of Charlottesville who does not believe the story, and not a few who know it, meaning there's lots that know it. Now, has he at this point given any facts? Nothing. It's all innuendo. It's all, and then when you look at his past, number one, he fled Britain and then started over here with seditious behavior, speaking that which would be, today we take a person to a court for what? When they said something, slander and libel, okay? So he was a person that was familiar with slander and libel in his character. He's a person that had to serve time for it. He's a person that once he got out and didn't get what he thought he deserved, that meaning from President Jefferson, he would come and now he's going to simply spin one of his tails, okay? And I'll back that up in a minute. Okay. If Duane, I think it's William Duane, who was the editor-in-chief for the Aurora newspaper. If Duane sees this account, he will not prate, speak about things that just endlessly, anymore about the treaty between Mr. Adams and Toussaint. And Toussaint is Toussaint Louverture. He was Haitian. And so one of the things when John Adams was president, he was trying to get good relations with this fellow who was trying to bring about a better government in Haiti, okay? And he spent a long time nurturing this, and John Adams got a lot of flack from a lot of people spending time doing that. So that's what he's talking about. He's saying if Duane, who runs the newspaper, sees this account, he will not continue this tedious discussion about the treaty between Mr. Adams and Toussaint. Behold the favorite. Who do you think he's talking about there? Behold the favorite, Thomas Jefferson. Behold the favorite, the firstborn of republicanism, the pinnacle of all that is good and great. In the open consummation of an act, meaning this relationship supposedly with the young girl, which tends to subvert the policy, the happiness, and even the existence of this country. To suppose that at the time when Mr. Jefferson wrote so smartly concerning Negroes, when he endeavored so much to belittle the African race, what he was talking about there is that in Jefferson's book about Virginia, he discussed the first meetings of slaves, when slaves came into his relationship, and he noted the fact that two things. Number one, he noted the fact that they seemingly were not as intelligent as white people in America. And he got a lot of flack about that. He then subsequently wrote, but I do believe that this is more, not in terms of something innate in the races, but something that has come about in relationship to the environment in which they live. In other words, if they live in an environment that is well-educated, then they will become educated. But because of the fact of coming from Africa and from tribal situations, they seemed not to be as well educated. So he had that first thought and then clarified. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay, okay, I'll just leave it at that. Okay. He had no expectation. Okay, so he's saying he at first belittled the African race, but he had no expectation that the chief magistrate, speaking of Jefferson, of the United States, meaning in his presidency, was to be the ringleader in showing that his opinion was erroneous when he corrected it, or that he should choose an African stock, meaning the young girl, whereupon he was to engraft his own descendants. You understand what he's saying there? He's saying there he's taking this poor child, having these children, and it's affecting his future generations and so forth. Okay. William Duane and James Cheatham are not worth asking whether this is a lie or not. Why? Because they both ran Republican newspapers. Thomas Jefferson was a Republican, okay? Democratic Republican. But Censor Smith is requested to declare whether the statement is a federal misrepresentation. He's not going to answer what he's saying either because he's a Republican newspaper man, okay? Mute, mute, mute. Yes, very mute. Will all those Republican printers of political biographical information be upon this point? Whether they stir or not, they must feel themselves like a horse in a quicksand. They will plunge deeper and deeper until no assistance can save them. In other words, he's saying, I'm right. I'm giving you no facts, but I'm telling you I am right here. And I don't care who runs what papers or whatever. They're not going to say anything because they can't defend him, because there's no way that they can defend this evil that he's done. The writer of this piece, meaning now he's referring to himself, okay? The writer of this piece, the one that I'm reading to you, has been arraigned as capable of selling himself to a British ambassador. Duh. That's true, okay? He was willing to sell himself for any price. He would be on either side, any side of the argument. If he could get money from John Adams, he'd be on that side. If he could get money from Thomas Jefferson, he'd be on that side. The thing you didn't want to do is do something that he could use for betrayal, because that's what's happening here. The impeachment of himself, Callender speaking, the impeachment was made by a printer who is in the confidence of Mr. Jefferson. The president had the utmost reason to believe that the charge against Callender was an utter fiction. This charge was met in a decisive style, meaning he is now going to present his defense. We at once selected and appealed to the testimony or belief of 5 persons who were intimately acquainted with the situation of Callender. He's speaking in third person. He's speaking of himself. At the period of the pretended project of sale, these were Mr. Israel, Dr. James Reynolds, Mr. John Beckley, Mr. John Smith, Federal Marshal of Pennsylvania, and Mr. Matthew Carey, bookseller whose name has been heard of in every county and corner of the United States. These are the people that he had to speak for him, but he was convicted of it, okay? The appeal harmonized with the feelings of innocence and defiance. If the friends of Mr. Jefferson are convinced of his innocence, they will make an appeal of the same sort. If they rest in silence, or if they are content, or if they content themselves with resting upon a general denial, they can not hope for credit. The allegation is of a nature too black to be suffered to remain in suspense. We should be glad to hear of its refutation. We give it to the world under the firmest belief that such a refutation never can be made. The African Venus, he's speaking about the young girl who's now older. The African Venus is said to officiate as housekeeper at Monticello. When Mr. Jefferson has read this article, he will find leisure to estimate how much has been lost or gained by so many unprovoked attacks upon J.T. Callender. End of letter. Well, what do you think of his letter there? No facts whatsoever, just filled with innuendo. And if you look at the history of the guy, you know where it's coming from. He felt betrayed, just like Benedict Arnold felt betrayed. And just like so many other people in life who feel betrayed will lie against someone that they feel betrayed them. Callender's life quickly began to disintegrate, in large part due to his bitterness and alcoholism. On December 20th, 1802, George Hay, Callender's past defense lawyer, beat Callender for threatening to publish stories about him. Callender continued to drink heavily, and upon breaking off his partnership with Pace, the guy earlier he was with, Callender was seen in a drunken stupor on July 17th, 1803, and later that day, he drowned in the James River. The Pulitzer Prize-winning historian James Truslow Adams states, quote, almost every scandalous story about Jefferson, which is still whispered or believed, can be traced to the lies in Callender's writings. Callender has been described by John C. Miller, the Stanford University historian, as, quote, a journalist who stopped at nothing and stooped to anything. He went on to explain, meaning the Stanford historian. Callender, quote, Callender made his charges against Jefferson without fear and without research. He had never visited Monticello. He had never spoken to Sally Hemings. He had never made the slightest effort to verify the, quote, facts he so stridently proclaimed. It was, quote, journalism at its most reckless, wildly irresponsible, and scurrilous. Callender was not an investigative journalist. He never bothered to investigate anything. For him, the story, especially if it reeked of scandal, was everything. Truth, if it stood in the way, was summarily mowed down. End of quote. Finally, Benjamin Ellis Martin, an ardent 19th century critic of Jeffersonian policies. Now, this is very important. What is being said here, in the 1800s, a fellow who studied Jefferson and did not like Jefferson as a president. Okay, so it's not a person that's on Jefferson's side in terms of his policies. Finally, Benjamin Ellis Martin, an ardent 19th century critic of Jeffersonian policies, characterized Callender, quote, I am unable to find one good word to speak of this man. He was a journalistic janissary. Now, a janissary is let's call him a Turkish hitman. Okay, that was part of an elite group in Turkey that would take you out. Okay, he was a journalistic janissary. His pen always for sale on any side. A hardened and habitual liar, a traitorous and truculent scoundrel, and the world went better when he sank out of sight beneath the waters of the James River. That's written by a person that didn't like Thomas Jefferson, but wrote that concerning Callender. Even though Thomas Jefferson could have taken the libelous Callender to court, Jefferson deferred, stating, quote, I know that I might have filled the courts of the United States with action for these slanders and have ruined perhaps many persons who are not innocent. But this would be no equivalent to the loss of my own character by retaliating against them. I leave them, therefore, to the reproof of their own consciences. If these do not condemn them, there will yet come a day when the false witness will meet a judge who has not slept over his slanders. End of quote. In a letter to Abigail Adams, Jefferson stated, he did not fear a blemish on his reputation from Callender's charges because, as he explained to Abigail Adams, John Adams' wife, quote, I am not afraid to appeal to the nation at large, to posterity, and still less to that being who himself sees our motives, who will judge us for his own knowledge of them. So what Thomas Jefferson is saying is, my record is my record, and I'll leave it up to God. Because if it's not worked out here, God's going to work it out. Before his death, Callender acknowledged that his attacks against Jefferson had been motivated by his belief that Jefferson had refused to repay a fine to Callender that had been extracted from him under the sedition law which then was rescinded by Jefferson in 1801. So he's saying is that he felt that he shouldn't have lost money in jail, that he should have had it returned to him, and when it was not, that along with not getting the postmaster job just increases anger, obviously. One additional note. One Thomas Woodson claimed Sally Hemings was his mother and that Jefferson was his father, and speculated that that is why his name was Thomas Woodson. The Nature article, which falsely accused Thomas Jefferson as being the father of Eston, demonstrated that the DNA study did prove one thing: Thomas Woodson's claim was fallacious. It's not true. Now, check this out. I've tried to present you the facts of the matter to give you an insight into the character of James Callender. But check this out. Despite all we have covered, if you Google, I Googled it yesterday, if you Google Callender's name and accusations, you will find the following. Quote, while Callender was widely viewed as a partisan hack during his life, well, duh, worse than that, his accusations against Jefferson, which were dismissed at the time, were largely vindicated by DNA evidence nearly 200 years later. Modern historians generally agree that Jefferson had a long-term sexual relationship with Hemings, confirming the general outline of the scandal Callender broke. And that's why I said it doesn't matter about facts. It matters what you really believe in here, what affects your emotions. And don't we see this every day? I mean, we see people in politics lying, but you know, it just they get away with it until something like has happened to Swalwell and to is it Rodriguez, the fellow in Texas? And again, like I said, I can't remember the guy's last name. But like I said, it's Republican, Democrat. It's just a matter of the character of the individual. Okay, so let's pick up at this point. Before we talk about this, I do want to pass out these, and then I want to look at the summary sheet, if you'll pass. You'll see in here, first of all, the picture that has been shown up there, the 2-cent stamp of Thomas Jefferson. And then what I promised you last week with slavery, with the issue of slavery, I wanted to give you the quote by Abraham Lincoln. It's also a stamp that was produced. It's a 4-cent stamp. It says on it, this is Abraham Lincoln quote, those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves. So that one you can take out and put in the other one. And then we get one tonight for Thomas Jefferson. As she's doing that, if you'll get a hold of your summary sheet, we'll just take a look at that very quickly. The two chief founding fathers people reject as moral guides for our age are George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Both were slave owners, and Jefferson was accused of fathering children with his 13-year-old slave. The accusation stems from a 1787 trip to Paris when Ambassador Thomas Jefferson took 13-year-old Sally Hemings with him to watch over his young daughter, Polly. The accusation itself surfaced September 1st, 1802, by a convicted felon by the name of James Thompson Callender. Callender, who fled to America when a pamphlet he wrote attacking the British government was labeled seditious in nature. Callender offered no proof, only innuendo in his attempt to derail Jefferson's career. While his attempt did not work, the latter part of the 20th century, 1998, witnessed a revival of the charges. Why did Callender accuse Jefferson? Like Benedict Arnold, who felt betrayed when he was court-martialed, so Callender felt betrayed when Jefferson did not give him the job of postmaster of Richmond, Virginia. Instead of taking Callender to court for slander, he rested on his life's work and believed God would justify him. DNA results exonerated Thomas Jefferson, though those who hate him still believe he is guilty, even though evidence points to his younger brother Randolph as the probable villain. Now, for those of you that have been watching at home, We are thankful that you've been with us, and whether it's just this week or during the whole 12-week series. And God bless you all.